Welcome, everyone. When we're talking about reparation and compensation and restitution, Dr. Finkelman, I'm especially interested in going back in time to sort of the founding of our country when we talk about the land that we are all settled on and the Native American genocide and the repair that I think most of us would say has never happened from that. So I'd like you to start there. So we're backing up in history to the very beginning.
So if you back up to the first English encounter with the New World, and I'm using the English encounter because ultimately the United States becomes an English colonies, even though it's important to acknowledge immediately that the Spanish were in Florida and the Spanish were in the Southwest United States well before the English arrived. And the Spanish set up some settlements in these places, but not very many. So we really start with Virginia in 1607 and the people who come to what is today Massachusetts starting in 1620 and then much more importantly in 1630. These English people who came to America, weirdly, from a historical perspective, expected the Indians to welcome them with open arms because the English who first come believe that they are going to liberate the native peoples of the New World from Spanish tyranny. They might have had that reception if they'd landed 600 miles south of where they landed. But there were no Spaniards in Virginia. There were no Spaniards in Massachusetts. And the native peoples were doing quite well without any Englishmen coming along to liberate them from anything. Once they arrive, they begin to settle. And as you can well imagine, there are intermittent conflicts between the English and native populations. Now, North America is relatively unsettled. Much of the land is truly vacant. It is forest. In New England and in Virginia, native peoples live in villages. They have communities, they farm. So there is, at least in the early 1600s, a lot of land to go around. It's not like the initial thing is you land and you fight a battle to chase the people who are there away. There's empty land. The English move on to the empty land. But of course, what we know is that the English come in enormous numbers. And the more they settle, the more they encroach upon native lands. And this ultimately leads to one conflict after another. Not always. William Penn arrives in the 1680s, and he essentially negotiates relationships with every American Indian tribe in Pennsylvania. And there is no warfare in Pennsylvania for 50 years because it's peaceful. It's an exchange of goods and money for land. And there's a lot of land in Pennsylvania. It's a very big place. Roger Williams comes to the tiny little colony of what becomes Rhode Island and does the same thing. He negotiates with the Narragansett Nation, and the Narragansett said, fine, you can settle in what becomes Providence and we'll continue to live in Rhode Island. And again, Rhode Island has no warfare with Indians until a New England-wide war in the 1670s, known as King Philip's War. So there would have been a model for peaceful getting along, or there could have been a model. There are certainly examples of it. But in the rest of the colonies, there's none of this. In the rest of the colonies, it is a combination of force, brutality, invasion, and often Native people simply leaving and going elsewhere because they don't want to fight the English. On top of this, just one more point. Native populations suffer devastating disease from their encounter with Europeans. This is not something anybody plans on. This is not something anybody tries to accomplish. It is going to happen because when you have large numbers of people who have been isolated from the microbiology of the rest of the world, when they encounter the rest of the world, you get devastation. Give you a very clear example of this. As best we can tell from the arrival of the first British settlers in the Hawaiian Islands, through the 1870s or 80s, there is virtually no Native Hawaiian who is killed by a bullet, by a gun, from a European or an American. In fact, the relationship between the Europeans and the Hawaiians, and then the Americans and the Hawaiians, is one of great happiness and friendship and affection. Hawaii is essentially a Stone Age culture. It has a very, very limited food supply. It has almost no agriculture. The Americans and the British bring all sorts of cool things, and the Hawaiians love it all, and they get along really, really well. And 60 to 70% of the Hawaiian population dies in this period from disease. And it's not anything that anybody is trying to make happen. This sort of microbiological encounter ends only when the English reach New Zealand, because by the time the English come to New Zealand, they understand what smallpox is. That's the big killer. And they, by force, inoculate the Maori in New Zealand. And the Maori are fierce soldiers. But the British Army, essentially says, we're going to give you a shot whether you like it or not, because we don't want to kill you. And so the result is there's a relatively large Maori population that survives, unlike other Native cultures. And by the way, the same smallpox, the same measles, the same diseases devastate significant portions of Central and South America, Mexico, wherever you have these encounters. There's a biological disaster. You have a question?
I do. Well, a little bit of comment. So I'm an Amherst College grad, and when I was there, our mascot was Lord Jeffrey Amherst.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we had. We were the Lord Jeffs, but it has, of course, come out in history that Lord Jeffrey Amherst intentionally gave smallpox infected blankets to Native Americans, knowing what that would cause. And so Amherst College has chosen not to change the name of the college because they claim they're named after the town. And I know we're getting a little ahead of ourselves because we're talking about name changes, but we have taken away our mascot, no longer being the Lord Jeffs, and we are now, I believe, the Mammoths.
Okay, so
give an example. Sometimes it was actually intentional.
So let me go to that, okay? Because if we're going to try and unpack history, we have to unpack it in a sophisticated way. All right. First of all, Amherst is 140 years later. Amherst is not coming in the 17th century. He is there in the mid 18th century. It's a very different time. Amherst is a general. He is fighting a war. Some of the people he's fighting with are Native Americans. As they say, all is fair in love and war. Amherst may be the first person to attempt biological warfare. By the way, whether Amherst succeeded in any of this is an interesting question. I'm not a biologist, although I have recently published 2 articles in medical journals on medicine and history. But it is not at all clear to me that the smallpox virus can survive outside of a human host long enough to infect anybody with a blanket. So that's the other piece of it would be, by the mid 18th century, smallpox is not the devastating disease it was 140 years earlier, because smallpox is now endemic to the New World, or at least to the East Coast, when it wasn't earlier. And so, you know, to understand, all I'm suggesting is that when cultures crash into each other, there is an awful lot of pain and suffering, whether it's intended or not intended. There are a group of Native Americans who go to the settlers of the Massachusetts Bay Company, which is Boston, and ask them to send their magic, that is smallpox, to their enemy villages down the road. You know, we are fighting them. Would you please use your magic to kill off them by disease? It's not a pretty world, you know. It's a world of warfare. It's a world of pain. The other thing that happens with the Puritans is they discover Indian villages that are completely empty because the Indians have either died or left. And so they view this as sort of a gift from God, that here are all these farms ready to be farmed. Here are all these villages that are completely empty. We can walk in and live there. So let me fast forward a bit, okay? Because what we need to get to is not this sort of early colonial action. By the way, the same thing happens in Virginia, and the Virginians are ruthless in killing Indians. And the Indians returned the favor. In 1622, probably a third of all of the settlers in Virginia are killed in a war brought about by an attack on the settlers. It is not a pretty world, but eventually, of course, first on the East Coast, then in the Midwest, then in the Great Plains, actually then in California, then in the Great Plains, because there's kind of, you leap over the Great Plains, fly over country before there were airplanes. It is this gigantic, powerful nation, the United States, fighting one Indian nation after another. And remember, there's no such thing as the Indians in America. What you have are very different nations, sometimes at war with each other, sometimes friendly with each other, sometimes allied with the United States against other native nations, other times allied with other native nations against the American settlers. But the settlement is relentless, and we negotiate ultimately treaties. Sometimes the treaties are negotiated after a war. Sometimes they're negotiated before a war. Most of the Iroquois, for example, shrewdly negotiate first with New York State and later with the United States government to avoid warfare after what we today call the 7 Years' War, although some of you, when you were in high school, it was called the French and Indian War, because the Indians understand that they're not going to win against these Europeans. So we acquire land by treaty. We sometimes acquire land by simply taking it. And by the way, the important early Chief Justice of the United States, John Marshall, in a very, very important opinion in the 1820s called Johnson versus McIntosh. Marshall says that the Indians have no rights to the land they live on except the right of occupancy. That is, they can occupy the land they are on, but that the United States, through a legal theory he calls the doctrine of discovery, has the right to take land from Indians whenever the United States wants, by treaty, by purchase, or by force. By the way, Johnson versus McIntosh is an Illinois case. And it involves land that was sold to some white investors by an Indian tribe, and then the Indian tribe left and went further west, took their money and ran. And then the United States later moves in and acquires the land and sells it to somebody else. And the original investors say, no, we bought it from the Indians. And Marshall says, well, no, you didn't buy it from the Indians because the Indians never owned it. They only had a right to occupy it. The United States owns it. So one way of seeing American history, you know, when we teach American history, we teach it from the East Coast to the West Coast. We teach it you know, John Smith comes to Virginia and the Pilgrims come to New England, and then John Winthrop comes to New England, when William Penn comes to Pennsylvania, and we move westward. The other way to teach American history would be from the opposite side, you know. We are here as native peoples, oh, and then we're here, and then we're here, and then suddenly we're here, and then suddenly some of us are gone. Because it's this relentless pushing of one native nation after another away. So when we come to the modern era and we come to the position of Indian nations today, what do we have? We have more than 400 treaties that the US signs before 1871. 400 treaties is a lot of treaties. We have treaties with different tribes, with different nations. Some of the treaties are almost kind of fair. Many of them are completely unfair. Some of them are somewhat fair on paper, but then completely disregarded by either the government or by white settlers as they move west. So we have this whole huge hodgepodge. To give you an idea, we talk a lot about the Trail of Tears, of the removal of what are known as the 5 civilized tribes from the Southeast: the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, the Cherokee, and the Seminole. Well, what makes them the 5 civilized tribes? One thing that makes them that is that they own black slaves. All of them are slaveholding. They all own black slaves. So from the perspective of a South Carolinian or Georgian, the Cherokee are kind of civilized because they're just like us. They buy and sell slaves. By the way, slaveholding is found in much of North America before the Europeans arrive, because as I pointed out a couple talks ago, slaveholding is found everywhere. You know, all cultures have slaveholding. The Aztec in Mexico are huge slave owners, but so are the Tlingit in the Pacific Northwest, who raid. They go from what is today southern Alaska as far south as Central California to attack other nations and enslave people. Slavery is pretty common. So anyways, to go back to the 5 civilized tribes, after the War of 1812, Andrew Jackson, as a general, negotiates treaties with most of the 5 civilized tribes to move west. And basically what Jackson tells the Creek, to use one example, is you have three choices. You can stay on your land and resist us and you'll get wiped out because we're stronger than you. And I know my Tennessee neighbors and I know what they'll do to you. You can leave your land, sell your lands, take up farming, cease being Creek, in other words. You can become sort of dark-skinned white people. And you can live here forever, and your descendants can live here, but you won't be Creek any longer because you will have to give up your nationhood. One of the things that Jackson, reason he does this is because the Creek sided with the British in the War of 1812, or many of them did. So he says, I can't have in my country a nation that's going to take up war against me. So I'm going to destroy your nation. Or the alternative is, we will give you 2 acres of land in what's called the Indian Territory, Oklahoma today, for every acre of land that you give to us. So if you have 100,000 acres of land, you can go to Oklahoma and get 200,000 acres of land. And a number of these Indian nations send emissaries to Oklahoma, and they actually plot out land that they move to, which is why there is a huge native population in Oklahoma, which is why Oklahoma at various times has had Native Americans representing it in Congress. On the other hand, the Cherokee in Georgia refused to accept any of these things and instead go into court, where Chief Justice John Marshall sides against them. And they then ultimately sign a removal treaty, and the removal is a catastrophe. By the way, Andrew Jackson is not the cause of the catastrophe because he's no longer president. It's Martin Van Buren, who doesn't know a thing about the military or a thing about Native peoples. And so the Trail of Tears is a disaster as the Cherokees move west and thousands of them die in the winter without provisions, without blankets, without food. Okay, so these are some of the issues you have. And then you have ultimately treaties with the Navajo. The Navajo Nation, which spans New Mexico and Arizona, but mostly is in Arizona. The Navajo Nation is about the size of West Virginia. It is a huge geographic area. So these are the different sorts of issues you have now. Fast forwarding, the US develops various policies towards Indians. And one of the policies is, starting in the late 19th century, to Americanize the Indians in a variety of ways. One of the disasters of this policy is to create Indian boarding schools, where Indian children are forced to go to school somewhere else, prohibited from speaking their own language. 10, 11-year-old kids are shipped to Pennsylvania to the Carlisle Indian School. You can see the graves of the young kids who die. Probably some of them die simply from depression because it's such a horrendous experience. There is also something known as the Allotment Policy, where vast areas of Indian lands are allocated to individual people rather than communally owned. This is an attempt to destroy tribal government, to destroy Indian government. And by the way, there are a number of white people who become what are known as $10 Indians, because for $10 they can get on the Dawes rolls and claim that they're Indian, and then they can get free land. So there's corruption all across the way. Corruption after corruption after corruption. Even where there seems to be peace, there is corruption and mistreatment. So that in Minnesota, there are treaties that are working. There are Indian lands that are set aside, but the payment to the tribes is delayed in part because of the Civil War. And the Indians are literally starving to death. And the Indian agents who make a fortune by selling things for more than they're worth to Indians refuse to give credit to Indians so they can buy food. And thus in 1862, you get something known as the Dakota War in Minnesota. It's actually one of the few Indian wars where the Indians kill more whites than the whites kill Indians. But all this is a result of corruption, of corrupt Indian traders and Indian agents, and the failure of the government to fulfill its promises. So in 1946, under President Truman, Congress finally passes something called the Indian Claims Commission. And the Indian Claims Commission says it is time for us to clean up this historical catastrophe, this historical mess, this oppression. We're not going to go back to Jeffrey Amherst and his blankets. We're not going to go back to the 17th century. We're going to go back to when we signed treaties and we made agreements. We have to start living up to the agreements we made. So the US appropriates about $1.3 billion, which is an awful lot of money in the 1940s and 1950s and into the 1960s. It's given to about 176 tribes or Indian bands. A band is like a sub-tribe. So for example, among some Indian nations, there are different groups which are called bands. So 176 allocations, a lot of money changes hands. We have created things like the Indian Health Service to provide hospitals and doctors on Indian lands. And of course, what we saw is that during COVID, it didn't work so well because particularly on the Navajo Nation, the death rates were higher than anywhere else. There have been lawsuits, there have been negotiations. But in thinking about all this, I did, of course, what every modern scholar does. I Googled the issue. And I found a couple of very interesting stories, including one where Native Americans talk about why they don't want reparations, why reparations is not what they are interested in, because reparations is simply an exchange of cash. And what Native Americans want is their land back. They want their place back. And in some places, they can't have the specific land they want back, but they could get other land. And there are, I should have had the exact number in front of me, but there are more than 500 recognized tribes. And then there are Indian tribes that aren't recognized, that are constantly trying to get recognized because they say the federal government hasn't recognized that we too are an Indian nation and we deserve recognition. So for example, the Lisjan Ohlone tribe in California is not a recognized tribe. It has been trying to get a tiny piece of land that is in the middle of Berkeley, California, which is currently or at least when the story that I read was written, which was a few years ago, was a parking lot. Underneath that parking lot is an Ohlone burial ground. They want their burial ground back. They want that significant piece of land that says who they are. And so the fight with the US government from native populations has been about land And it has been about what is called sovereignty, the right to govern themselves, the right to control their own space, the right to pass their own laws. And it has had very mixed success. In some places, it works pretty well. The Navajo again have a lot of land, a lot of people, a government. They elect a new president of the Navajo Nation. When people run for re-election, other nations are less fortunate. They aren't as big. They aren't as powerful. One of the ironies, of course, of all this is that one of the pieces of Indian sovereignty that natives do have is that they are not under state tax laws and they are not under state gambling laws. And so if you live near a reservation, you drive onto the reservation to buy your cigarettes because they're avoid state and federal taxes. You might buy gas on a reservation, and of course you go to a reservation to gamble. So at one level, you could say that there have been reparations for Native Americans. On the other, what you could say is that these are not reparations, but they are in fact simply fulfillment of legal agreements that the United States has not been following. I want to read something from a man named Kanasarakan, who is a Mohawk leader. The Mohawk are in upstate New York. The Mohawk live in both Canada and the US. And he is a Mohawk in upstate New York. By the way, this is very close to where I grew up, so I know this region well. And he said a few years ago in discussing this, somewhere in this world, there's going to be a people who are going to open their eyes and ears and put pressure on the oppressors of North America and make them respect the original peoples of this land. America owes its people, more so than me, it owes its people the truth as it actually is, right from the first day that we met on the shores of the ocean, all the way through to correct history, because all of the history that you're being told in the public schools, it's all lopsided. And so for Native Americans, the push has been for land, for sovereignty over that land, for access or sovereignty to sacred sites that they don't own. And this, again, this is a very hard thing for mainstream America to understand. So when Native Americans say, don't build this road across this mountain because it will violate our deepest held religious beliefs, most Americans can't comprehend that, because for most Americans, you build a church and you go to the church and pray. You build a synagogue, you build a mosque, you build a Hindu temple, you build a Buddhist temple, you build an ashram, you build a kingdom hall, you build a tabernacle in Salt Lake, and you pray inside the building. So we have a very hard time as a culture wrapping our heads around the notion that a lake or a mountain or a stream is a sacred site. But of course it is. And so there was a case about 30 years ago where a tribe in I believe it was Washington State, sued to prevent the building of a road on federal land. And the Supreme Court ruled that federal government can do anything it wants on federal land. And the federal government has no obligation to respect Indian religion. However, Congress then passed a law prohibiting the road from being built by refusing to fund it. So there are political ways of dealing with some of these issues. So this is a kind of reparation. But when we think about this in the context of, say, reparations for slavery, it gets really, really complicated because most of the payments to Indians, most of the monetary transfer has not been to individuals, it's been to tribes. It's been to a political entity. So that when the Indian Claims Commission gives out money, most of the time it went to a particular tribe. When the Congress created the law to create the Indian Health Service, it was for all tribal members in an area to be able to have access to doctors and hospitals. It wasn't, here's a cash payment to you so that you can find a doctor for yourself in the future. And so as we fight through all this, we are again circle back to the problem that we use the word reparation, but one size never fits all. I want to give, I talked about this earlier in this talk, and I just want to circle back to it for a minute because it makes a certain amount of sense. So that under the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, signed by President Reagan, the United States appropriated $20,000 for each person who was alive who had been interned in a Japanese American internment camp in World War II. This is a very targeted individual reparation for an individual harm. Now, nobody would say, and again, this goes back to the issue, nobody would say that $20,000 is compensation that matches the harm. During the debates over this, when people said, why are we giving them all this money? People said, well, would you be willing to be incarcerated for all of World War II for $20,000? And of course, nobody's raising their hand. Nobody's saying, yeah, that I would be happy to do that. So the $20,000 is real money. And for some people, it mattered a great deal, but it's also symbolic money. It's a symbolic payment, just like the Mohawk leader who I quoted, who says, we have to get the history right. We have to tell the story. We have to tell the story of Jeffrey Amherst. Because in the end, it doesn't matter whether Amherst's blankets could harm people or not. What matters is that somebody would come up with this and say, it's okay to do this, when it clearly wasn't okay to do this. And that's the complexity. So let me I want to move on to talk about a place called Rosewood. But before I do it, I want to ask if you have any questions on what I've been talking about, or comments, or disagreements. And I hear none. Yes. Vern.
Yeah, just quickly without diverting too much, but are there current, now, you're talking about the 50s and 60s, are there current attempts to do reparations in relation to Native Americans, or newer, fresher, they have any legs?
There are constant issues. I mean, it's always coming up. In part because you have more than 500 recognized tribes, and then you have significant number of tribes that aren't recognized. So yes, there are various kinds of issues that are constantly coming up. And of course, what's fascinating is to see white communities get really upset when suddenly there's a prosperous Indian casino near them. Because it's like, why are they getting all the money? Why aren't we getting all the money? And you see some states thinking maybe we should be more like New Jersey or Nevada and have our own casinos because it's so profitable. But yeah, there are always always conflicts. By the way, some of you may wonder why I use the word Indian rather than Native American. Part of it is that in American law, it is Indian law. If you go to a law school where I used to teach in law schools, there's a course called Federal Indian Law, and it's the Indian Claims Commission. And I lived in Oklahoma for 7 years. I taught at the University of Tulsa. And I don't think I ever met a tribal member who referred to herself or himself as a Native American. They always say, we're Indians. So however weird the designation is, because Columbus thought he'd reached India, so he found the Indians. However weird the designation is, I have come to the conclusion that at least all of the native peoples that I have met usually use that term. But nomenclature changes, and there are always fights over nomenclature. And I think you should call people what they want to be called, what they call themselves.
The only other thing I wanted to say very briefly without you commenting on is, it seems if we make a huge movement in this country toward reparations for African Americans, I wonder what kind of blowback there's going to be. Because when I talk to some people about it, they say, well, what about this? What about the Native Americans or Indians? What are they going to say? That kind of thing. We can't do it all or whatever. You don't have to comment on that. It just seems that might open a can of worms, but I hope it's a can of worms that gets opened. So thank you.
Well, it is a can of worms, and it's a question of what you're, again, which is what I've been talking about now over and over again, the just immense complexity of it. Let me give you another specific reparation right before I get to Rosewood. I suspect most of you have heard of something called the Tuskegee Experiment. The Tuskegee Experiment began in the 1930s when there was no known cure for syphilis, except the possibility of people taking a medicine made out of mercury, which of course is also toxic. And American scientists were trying to figure out, how do we deal with syphilis, which is ultimately a fatal disease, although it usually takes a long time. Tuskegee, as you know, is one of the most important historically Black colleges in the United States, in Alabama. And Tuskegee University and the United States government worked out a experiment, what today we would call a longitudinal health study, right? Of a number of men who had syphilis. And the deal was this: if you agreed to come to the Tuskegee Experiment, you would get free lifetime health. Now, this is before Medicare, this is before Medicaid, this is obviously before the Affordable Care Act. This is when poor people died because they couldn't afford a doctor. And hundreds of mostly poor Black men were given lifetime medical care. And all they had to do was come to Tuskegee and get it for anything. But they couldn't seek out any kind of other treatment for their syphilis. And the idea is that this longitudinal study would determine whether using things like mercury actually worked. Well, this was probably a fairly reasonable medical study until somebody discovered that penicillin kills syphilis. And the rest of the country got penicillin, and the Tuskegee Experiment just kept going and going and going. And nobody bothered to say, wait a minute, why are we doing this? Why are we continuing to do this when we could give everybody a shot of penicillin and cure their syphilis? And it finally was exposed in the 1960s. There was a class action suit brought against the federal government on behalf of the survivors of the Tuskegee Experiment. And there was, I believe, an out-of-court settlement or a statutory settlement, which appropriated $10 million to be given to all of the survivors, who by this time, of course, were getting penicillin and were being cured. They got $10 million to divide among the survivors, and they got lifetime health care as well. So that's another kind of example of a specific, I would say not a reparation, but a compensation for bad behavior on the part of everybody, on the part of Tuskegee, on the part of the United States government, on the part of the nurses and the doctors who knew perfectly well they should be doing something else and they weren't, because they were so caught up in their own institutional mindset. And this is, an example of how once you get inside the institutional mindset, you just keep doing it because it's your job to keep doing it. You get your salary, you get your federal grant, the university gets its federal money, and it just keeps going and going and going. Now I want to talk about Rosewood for a minute. So Rosewood is a small town in Florida. In 1923, there was a very nasty race riot in Rosewood. It was a Black community. Most of the town was burned to the ground. At least 6 people were killed, maybe more, we don't know, but probably not a whole lot more than 6. And in 1994, the state of Florida passed a law appropriating $2.1 million to give reparations for the small number of people who were still alive as victims of Rosewood. And there were 9 survivors. They each got $100,000. Later, they each got another $50,000. And $500,000 was set aside to buy or recompense people for property destroyed that they would have inherited. So this would be the inherited property. If your father's house was burned down, then you could apply for some of the money. In addition to that, Florida passed a law saying that the descendants of those who were harmed in the Rosewood massacre, the riot, would get free tuition at Florida state colleges and universities. Yeah, Renee, you had a question.
Right. My question is, in this case, was that a voluntary move on Florida's behalf, or were they sued by the survivors or some other entity that brought that about?
Well, the legislature appropriated the money. So it's an act of the Florida legislature. I suspect, and I will admit, I am not an expert on Rosewood. It's hard to be an expert on everything. And I know more about Puritan New England and early Jamestown than Rosewood, so there's just so much you can cram in your head on any given lifetime. I believe that the legislative act was stimulated by the threat of lawsuits. However, I don't think the lawsuits would have been successful. And again, that's so even if it was the threat of a lawsuit, it is very, very difficult to litigate the past. It is very difficult to litigate history. I used to be a law professor. I'm a historian by training. I have been involved in many lawsuits, or usually as an expert witness or as somebody who's writing what's called an amicus brief, which is a brief to the court on not as a lawyer for somebody, but as what's called a friend of the court. You can't sue, you can't litigate history. So I think Florida simply did this because it was the right thing to do. Now, the other piece of this, of course, is, I mean, I know for everybody on this, in this event today, $2.1 million is a lot of money. For the state of Florida, it's not a lot of money. You know, and for the state to say, okay, we'll give you $2.1 million and free tuition at the universities, big deal. Because you're only talking about a very, very small category of people. And you're talking about a very precise, clear event that is clearly illegal, that is clearly a violation of everybody's rights. And you have living people who were harmed by the event. So that it's not like, you know, somebody suing for something that happened a long time ago and there aren't any living people who are involved.
So you contrast that then with what happened in Tulsa after those race riots, where there was litigation that I believe you said failed at a federal level. Did Oklahoma on its own choose to do like Florida did, or did it say, well, your lawsuit failed, so we're not doing anything?
Well, I will. So this is kind of insider war story, okay? Because I was a professor at University of Tulsa Law School when this happened. I had an endowed share at the law school, which gave me a certain cachet, whether I deserved it or not. You know, the title comes with some cachet, enough so that I can actually have a conversation with people in the governor's office at a reasonably high level. And I was friends with the people who were bringing the lawsuit. And I tried to arrange a meeting between the people bringing the lawsuit and the state to come up with a solution that was not litigation. And, you know, one of the things I suggested is that you go to Greenwood, which is the black neighborhood that had been destroyed, and you build something that would be good for the community. You build a community health center. You build a public library and a community health center. You do something, in other words, that would be a reparation, that would be a repair of the community. And I got some sympathetic thoughts from the governor's office, because the governor, after all, is political. And this is, you know, what better way to solve the problem than to provide jobs for people by building something, to build something that's useful to the community. You're not giving cash out to people, you're making Tulsa a better city. And the Attorney General, who of course is also an elected official, but not under the control of the governor, as is true in most states, the Oklahoma Attorney General simply said, you know, we're going to win this case. We don't have to settle anything. We don't have to negotiate. There's nothing to negotiate. You don't have a case, you're going to lose. And Attorney General's office was right. So nothing happened. At the same time, there was a private foundation, which for a short time I was actually the president of the foundation, that was trying to build a memorial. It was the 1921 Tulsa Memorial Foundation. We wanted to build a memorial to the victims of the race riot and to those people who helped the victims. So it was a kind of a, you know, a larger than just the African American community, because there were a number of white people who tried to help prevent the riot and try to save people's lives. And we got money from the state legislature. State legislature put the foundation into the budget. And now there is a public park in Tulsa. It is the Tulsa Reconciliation Center. Again, a notion that you reconcile, that you repair. It is named for a great historian, a man named John Hope Franklin, who was probably the most important Black academic of the last half of the 20th century. He was from Tulsa. He grew up in Tulsa. His father was one of 2 Black lawyers when the Tulsa race riot happened. And his father helped prevent seizing all of the land that Blacks had owned by the state, or harming it after the riot. I have to also, in full disclosure, Franklin was also one of my 2 PhD mentors. So the one thing I accomplished was to get the center named for him. But with the exception of some state money, it was mostly funded by private foundations. Most importantly, I believe, and then this was built after I moved out, but it was mostly built, I think, with money from the Kaiser Foundation, from a guy named George Kaiser, who is very philanthropic. So that's another model, you know, that the reparation is not payments to individual. The reparation is to repair the community by having a reconciliation center, by having lectures, by having history, by having meetings, by having ways, interfaith, interracial communication and cooperation.
I see that. Because we are running out of time, and this has been very interesting, could we use a last few minutes to talk about these? I think that's a good segue into name changes and
Sure.
taking monuments down as a method of repair.
Okay, so if I were sort of asked to write a policy statement on the United States, you know, what should we do about names? I think we could categorize place names. We could categorize buildings and institutions named for other people in a variety of ways. The easy one was actually in the military appropriations bill that that in his final moments of being president, Donald Trump vetoed, because the military appropriations, I think he's like the first president since World War II to veto a military appropriations bill. And he vetoed it because it required the name change for military bases named for Confederate generals. You know, so one of the things I think the United States has to come to terms with is the Civil War was about slavery, and it was about treason. And General Hood and General Bragg and many of the other generals who have bases named for them were traitors. Most of them had gone to West Point. They had taken an oath to support the United States, Constitution of the United States. And then they went to war against the United States. So the easiest thing is to change all the military base names, to get rid of things named for Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson and all of those other people who were pro-slavery traitors. That's really simple. You could go a little bit further and say, when we deal with politicians in the pre-Civil War or post-Civil War era who were egregiously, vigorously pro-slavery, it's time to take their names down. For example, Yale University has these residential colleges, most of them built in the 1930s, and one of them was named Calhoun College. because John C. Calhoun had gone to Yale as a young man. And in the last decade or so, Yale changed, I believe Yale finished changing the name of Calhoun College, because in the 1930s, nobody thought much about it. Calhoun was a senator, he was a vice president, he was famous, he's a Yale grad, why not name a college for him? Well, he was also as egregiously pro-slavery as you could get. So that's an easy category. Another easy category would be to begin to change roads and place names and the names of football and baseball teams that are blatantly racist. You know, Cleveland has a baseball team. Nobody knows what it's called anymore because Cleveland finally stopped calling themselves the Indians. And you know, Indians are not mascots. They're not, you know, like, you know, the Chicago Bears. The Bears are a mascot. Nobody's asked the Bears if they like it or not because we can't talk to bears. But Indians are not mascots, nor are other ethnic groups. And so that again would be an easy transition to do. And the fact that there could be a football team called the Redskins is just an abomination. You know, and we can all think of many ethnic slurs. I will use my own community, right? We would not call a baseball team in New York the New York Yids or the New York Kikes. We wouldn't do it. We would say, no, you can't do that. That's racist. That's anti-Semitic. So how do you have the Washington Redskins? So that's the easy stuff. And there are place names like this, by the way, you know. There are, you know, mountains called Squaw Mountain, for example, which again is a derogatory term for a Native American woman. So place names are easy to do. Then you get to statues. What do you do with statues? I was called by a county historical society in Maryland. What should they do with the statue in front of the building to Roger B. Taney, the egregiously pro-slavery justice who hated free blacks, couldn't stand the idea of free blacks, who wrote the Dred Scott decision? And I said, well, it's really easy. You're a historical society. You take it down, you put it in the building with an explanation of who he was. The statue might be a nice bronze statue. I'm not suggesting you melt it down. I'm suggesting that it become a teaching moment, because I think that's what you do. It's like President Obama, a great Illinois senator, right? When asked what to do with Confederate flags, they said, put them in museums where they belong. You don't fly them, you put them in museums. And when people say, well, the Confederate flag is our heritage, so what? Your heritage, if it is your heritage, it means you favor slavery and you favor segregation. Furthermore, it's important to note that for almost a century, the Confederate flag disappeared from the American landscape. And then in the 1950s, after the decision in Brown v. Board of Education, that is when states like South Carolina began to fly the Confederate flag on their state capital. That's when states like Georgia added, I believe it was Georgia, and also Mississippi added the Confederate stars and bars to their state flag. So the Confederate flag was resurrected by the anti-integrationists of the 1950s. It was resurrected by the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan marches with the Confederate flag. So is that your heritage? Well, I'm sorry, we don't recognize your heritage. You know, nobody would in Germany would last 10 seconds saying, oh, I want to fly the swastika because it's the heritage of my grandfather. He was in the World War II German army.
I think that is a great place to end.
Okay,
I think you put an exclamation point after that. And I appreciate everybody who showed up today. I appreciate all that you, yeah.
I
go
say
ahead.
just one more explanation point,
Yep.
which is this, that people say, well, the name has been there for a long time. We shouldn't change the name. Why shouldn't you change the name? We change names all the time. Almost every city I know has a Martin Luther King Boulevard Street or Drive in it. That street was called something else before it was called Martin Luther King. You know, Baltimore Airport was renamed for Thurgood Marshall. It wasn't called that before. We rename things all the time. Every culture renames things. We rename streets, we rename cities. We, you know, during World War I, there were towns called Berlin or Bismarck that were renamed Pershing because it was a patriotic thing to do. Renaming is easy. And again, to go back to the last exclamation mark, you know, there were lots of streets in Germany with names like Adolf Hitler Strasse. They changed those names. There used to be a city in Russia called Leningrad. Before that, it was St. Petersburg. Now it's back to St. Petersburg. There was a city called Volgograd, which became Stalingrad. And now guess what? It's back to Volgograd. You get rid of you don't honor the dishonorable. That's the point.
That's the point. All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Finkelman. I look forward to our next conversation